Hey, deserving listeners, Love is Blind. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. Keep in mind that since this is a psychology YouTube channel, we might get into some triggering material depending on the content of the show and depending on what you might get triggered by. So, watch with care. Let's watch.
Okay, does that bug you?
What?
The fireplace.
Oh, the offsetter? Yeah. I was like, what do you mean? Well, now that you pointed out, it wouldn't have.
Okay, interesting. I don't know what they're getting at. It sounds like they both, or at least Monica, has a preference for things being lined up. Sometimes people associate that with compulsive or obsessive issues, but you can just have a preference for that. Along these lines, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but it is a preference of mine for things at least to be lined up, not necessarily like a fireplace, but like there's a subreddit. I can't remember what it's called, but it has it's not mildly infuriating because that's a popular subreddit, but it's one of the other ones that specifically has to do with things not lining up. And people will post things on there just to see if it irks everyone on the subreddit. And like they might show a sandwich being cut off center, and yeah, it's not my preferred thing to see, but it doesn't get to me that the way it would with some. But along those lines, my shelf, it looks like my camera is tilted, but it's not. It has to, maybe you know this, but it has to do with perspective. So if I were to move the camera more lined up this way, then it would be straight, believe me, because I've done that. But because I've moved the camera this way, because I have to fit over here on this side of the camera, the field of view, that it essentially, my bookshelf back there is further away. So it's like the sun rays coming through the clouds, right? The sun rays are not going like this. They're straight for the most part. But because the perspective, it looks like the sun rays are going like this, right? So that's what's happening. Sometimes my shoulders also will do it. It'll look like my shoulders are off. And of course, people that are on their computer all the time will have certain raised or off-center things about their body. Anyway, so if that ever bothers you, because it kind of gets to me sometimes. But if I actually correct for it, it will be tilting the camera, and then I will be so.
Would not have a moment ago.
Just curious.
But
I think like the reason my OCD stuff happened was almost like a way to control something that because my life was very chaotic, that it was
Okay, so he's actually talking about actual OCD. I think, although we'll see, the way he's talking, I will frequently or occasionally, whenever it comes up on the show, when people say, oh my God, I'm so OCD, I like my things to be clean or something. And if that's all that it is, then you're just tidy or you're meticulous or you just like things to be clean. It's not OCD. OCD is one of the worst mental illnesses one could ever suffer from. It is the worst. It is horrific. It is life ruining. It's not just a minor preference or a minor difficulty with things being off center or something. It is, it's the worst. So I hope, I hope he is not actually suffering from OCD and that he is talking about it in the TikTok way, but he is tying it to difficulty, which at the very least I could potentially get behind. He's talking about life being chaotic, and so he seeks to control things, or he wants things to be in order. And what I'll say about that is that, yes, that can be a factor potentially. We can never know where OCD comes from, how it is caused. we can only look at large groups of people and measure very crude factors like asking them if they've experienced chaos in the past, and of course, what's bad chaos versus normal chaos, and you're asking the individual. We can't follow people around with drones and measure everything that they go through. We just have to take their word for it because that's all that we have available to us in the research. So we can't really know, but it's a common misunderstanding that that's where OCD always comes from. OCD, generally speaking, has, as a lot of disorders, seemingly a genetic component, meaning that if it runs in your family, you're more likely to develop it. Another factor, major factor, is the experiences that you go through. Compiling and absorbing all the research, of which there are thousands of studies looking not only at the factors that seem to contribute to OCD, but also the factors that seem to contribute to a lot of related illnesses like phobias and other kinds of anxieties, severe anxieties, because in my mind they are related. It's debatable as to whether or not they are, but what I will say, and one of the consensi in our field, is that when one is generally neglected emotionally as a young person, what it does to a young child is it puts them in a chronic state of fear and threat and danger, even though there might not even be danger. Now, of course, if there is danger, then that increases the risk of this. But even if the child has all of their needs taken care of, but they don't get a felt sense of their caregivers really there with attunement and contact and attention and within eyesight, we're talking 0 to 2 years old, 0 to 3, then the child neurologically will fire too many circuits in their brain related to fear and danger and threat and hypervigilance. And the theory goes is that once those circuits become very robust in the brain, then they have a tendency later in life to overfire. And what will happen is you'll have a 15-year-old who is overfiring on their amygdala and their fear, hypervigilance, little things that are and one of the, I'll finish that thought. So then that further makes that circuit in the brain more robust. And then by the time you're an adult, you have a very robust fear system that is basically constantly working. And one of the things that seemingly will happen is that the brain will be experiencing fear and anxiety and threat and danger automatically, but our mind, and particularly our prefrontal cortex, will be trying to figure out why, because that's typically what's happening, right? When we were on the African savanna during the Pleistocene 300,000 years ago, we would have fear and we would look around. What is it? A tiger? Is it a jaguar? It was usually one of the big cats that was eating us, seemingly. There's archaeological evidence of that. So we would be primed to look around. What is it that I'm afraid of? I feel fear. Maybe I subconsciously heard a snap of a twig behind a bush, or I saw something out of the corner of my eye. And so we seemingly, and maybe a lot of animals have this mechanism that when we notice that we feel something, we look around for why we are feeling that way. Well, when you have a constant buzz of danger and threat and fear and anxiety, your brain starts, one, looking for what is it about my environment that's causing this? And also, how do I solve it? How do I solve this feeling? Well, if your feeling has no cause and there is no solution, then you can develop OCD as a solution to that because it gives you something to focus on. It's not that I'm just constantly afraid because I was neglected 0 to 3. It's because it's because I must have left the stove on, so I have to go back home. Or it's because I'm not praying enough, or it's because my hands aren't clean enough, or it's because I wasn't paying attention to how many steps there were in a stairwell. And when I don't pay attention to that, then that means that someone will die because of the old saying, like step on a crack, break your mama's back. And that will actually be focused on by some people. It's rare, but people will actually buy into that. And it's not that they believe in it, but they feel they have to focus on it, and they feel they have to participate in the routines and the ceremonies and the actions and the compulsions to fix the problem and manage the problem. So that's one way of looking at OCD. So anyway, I hope that he doesn't have it, and I hope that he's just talking about being a little meticulous and wanting things to be in order. Like for some people, I can imagine they might think they have OCD, but they don't. And it would be more accurate to describe the individual as growing up in chaos and not liking it, and as a child looking for things that are in order, not in a OCD, anxiety, compulsive, obsessive way, but it's something that is a defense. It's something that helps them, sort of like daydreaming or smoking cigarettes or playing in the corner with your toys, whatever, a coping mechanism that a child develops in response to a difficulty. And so one could be compulsive and start really focusing on things being in order and really wanting things to be in order because of the chaos. And in all likelihood, we wouldn't diagnose the individual with OCD. OCD has a lot of markers that are very particular to it. The suffering and the rigidity of it and the way it can often morph between different obsessions. There's germs one year, and then there's, religion another year, and then there's things being in order and tidy and, making sure that you leave the house in this perfect, arbitrary kind of order thing. Anyway, so let's see what he's talking about here. Either way, it sounds like, he has suffered in the past.
It always got worse, like when something happened. So like if my sister went into the hospital, or if like there was some type of added stressor, maybe it was my parents fighting or something like that.
Yeah.
Everything was counted. So like everything you can imagine. So like walking, my steps I took.
Okay, yeah, that's sounding more like genuine OCD. It very much sounds like genuine OCD. And it can very much coincide with stress for some obvious reasons, right? And yeah, it sounds so strange from the outside, unless you have tendencies or also have suffered from this. It's a private hell. It's a private, weird world. And again, I want to say that the individual, in all likelihood, has insight in that they know that it's not rational, but they can't help it. Some people will believe their own obsessions and their own irrationality, like with germs, for example. But with the counting, it's hard for an individual to justify that to themselves, and yet they still do it because it just feels like they have to. There's also some neurology that I could get into regarding motivation and how that is managed in the brain, and how medications seem to help with OCD in this way. But the medications that we have are kind of like sledgehammers to put a nail in that's like really small, if that makes any sense. Or maybe another analogy would be that you're trying to kill a spider and you drop like a 2-ton car on top of it to kill it. I'm exaggerating. I should say. The point is that we don't have medications, generally speaking, that target just the symptom. We have medications that help with that symptom, but the compound in the system, throughout the system, tends to have a lot of other effects because for reasons having to do with evolution, our bodies don't have specific neurotransmitters for one function. We have neurotransmitters, generally speaking, and there's a lot of them, that are used for all sorts of things. That's why the neurotransmitter having to do with THC and marijuana, cannabinoids, these neurotransmitters are throughout the body, and that's why when you smoke weed or use cannabis, that you experience the psychotropic pleasant effects. But there's also all these other effects, like the red eyes and the munchies and movement issues, and you'll have issues in other parts. Anyway, so, or like when you take an SSRI for depression and you get constipation because there's a lot of serotonin in your gut, and there's the whole like brain gut system, which I won't go into right now. But anyway, so yeah, he's talking about when he's stressed, in particular, the OCD symptoms get worse, and he has to count everything. And just imagine that you have to count, and so by counting, you are staving off. The way that I would describe it is that you're at a 10 out of 10 on the distress scale. It's very stressful internally with OCD. And by counting, you bring that down from a 10 to like a 7 or a 5 maybe. So as you do the routine, the compulsion, you feel relief to some extent, but not completely, and it's brief. It's just getting over that next hill. Okay, I counted everything. I'm fine. I'm good with that. Okay, on to the next. Okay, now I have to count all these things. Oh, I messed it up. Or someone interrupted me. I was just, shut up. I've got to count everything. And okay, I've done that. All right, next thing. It's not that. It's not voluntary, really, and it doesn't feel good in the end. It just feels less bad.
How many times I lifted up a spoon, how many times I drank something, how many times I picked something up. Everything was done in a numbered way, or things had to be touched a certain way. So my index finger was something always had to touch an object last, or if I walked out of a door, it always had to be out with my right foot.
Yeah, this is classic OCD. Yeah, classic. And it's interesting because I think most people would look at Joey and think he would be the least likely to suffer from any anxiety, let alone OCD. And I want to highlight that because you can't look at someone and know if they have anxiety. Sometimes a famous person that seems very confident will come forward as suffering from severe anxiety. And I also just want to say, and I come from this old school of thinking that actually has OCD under the anxiety umbrella. And there are reasons to maybe not do that. It's not a huge controversy in my field, but there are some ideas about categorization. I will be talking about OCD in the anxiety umbrella because to me it is very close. In fact, there are times when OCD and phobias and PTSD and generalized anxiety, particularly generalized anxiety and OCD, are hard to differentiate. So that says something, right? Anyway, and the way people talk about their experience. And you can have generalized anxiety with compulsions, but you don't have OCD anyway. So I'm just going to be talking about it in that sense. And I want to also remind people that anxiety is one of, if not, the overall category is, from my memory, don't quote me on this, is the most common mental illness or the most common label in the DSM that is legitimately endorsed by symptoms of humans, particularly in the United States, because those are the people that have been studied a lot. But it seems to be true all over the world. There are different names for these disorders in other cultures. I did a whole episode on culturally bound mental illnesses. I can't remember, but just look it up. Culturally bound. Anyway, so it's important to say that because if you just asked the average person on TikTok, the average consumer of TikTok, what are the most commonly, things in the DSM that people have, they would say ADHD and autism, and that is just not the case. I mean, depending on how you measure it, there's a lot of people with ADHD and autism, and there's a lot of underdiagnosing. Conversely, there's a lot of overdiagnosing, but certainly there's a lot of underdiagnosing. But anxiety and I'm not talking about just like minor anxiety. I'm not talking about nervousness a little bit or having trouble sleeping occasionally because something's on your mind. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about full-blown mental illnesses, full-blown OCD, full-blown phobias, full-blown generalized anxiety, full-blown, and to some extent, depending on how you look at it, PTSD can be considered also anxiety-related at the very least. And so I say all this because it's just not trending to be. It's not sexy. It's not interesting for people. I don't understand why. Like postpartum anxiety is actually pretty common as well, but you only hear about postpartum depression. And compared to autism and ADHD, you don't even hear about depression very often. And I say all this because there's just a lot of suffering going on, and if I had it my way, there would be 5 to 10 times more TikTok videos about anxiety than there would be about autism and ADHD. Not that I wouldn't want there to be awareness of ADHD and autism, of course, but I would want so much more about anxiety. There's so many people suffering and so little resources, and yet therapy can help. With OCD, there are a few things in the DSM that have that I would be able to say based on research and my own personal clinical experience and my own personal experience as a human. I suffer from a lot of anxiety. I have since I've been a teenager. I've noticed it anyway as a teenager. And I've successfully gone through treatment and treated myself. So I have a chip on my shoulder about it, I guess. And so I will say that of the things in the DS, like if someone came to me, if I had 5 new clients and one had an anxiety disorder, another had PTSD, another had major depressive disorder, another had borderline personality disorder, and another person had, dissociation or something, I would be much more optimistic about a short-term relief of and maybe medium-term complete relief of symptoms with the first 2 clients, with someone who had an anxiety disorder and the other client who had PTSD. With depression, maybe, but depression can be really hard to affect. There are ways to affect it for sure, but I've had clients where, they call it treatment resistance, and it can be really hard. So especially, and also with personality disorders and with dissociation, it can take a long time. So, and maybe with dissociation, I have a little bit of optimism, but I say all that because there's just so many people suffering, a lot more people suffering from anything else. And there's all these therapists out there that hopefully know how to treat this sort of thing. And just think about if we just directed our awareness and our efforts as a public health system, as an internet system, towards helping these people, including him. Now, it sounds like he has a lot of awareness, and hopefully he's gone through treatment. I would imagine he wouldn't want to talk. In fact, a lot of people with OCD don't even want to talk about their obsessions because they are ashamed, but also they're worried that other people will misunderstand it and prank them of it, because they think it's just a funny little quirk that they have. I remember John Green, the author of Something All the Way Down, I can't remember, and that other Fault in My Stars. And he has, he's the history vlogging, I can't remember. Vlogbrothers, definitely, I know that. I'm terrible at remembering things. He also has one of my favorite podcasts, one of my wife's favorite podcasts too, Anthropocene Reviewed. And he has a book that is behind me. I think my wife got a signed version, or I did. Anyway, he has talked about his OCD, and from my memory in the past anyway, he wouldn't want to talk about the specifics of his obsessiveness, of his obsessions. And I don't know why, but I wondered if I think he might have even said this, that he worries that if he were to tell the public, then some people would either try to troll him with the triggers of the obsession, or they would misunderstand it as a minor thing, and they would like expose things. Like someone says they're afraid of spiders or something, and people will prank that person by having fake plastic spiders that show up somewhere. And if someone has a minor fear of spiders, maybe that would be funny. But if someone has a legit phobia, you could be causing not only just throwing them into symptoms for like months, maybe causing them to want to quit the job and distance themselves from you and maybe become agoraphobic in their house. But you could actually cause neurological damage to their brains because of the overload that occurs in the moment.
Yeah. Was it involuntary, or you were like hyper aware?
You're like aware of it. It's weird.
Yeah.
So you understand that it's.
Yeah, and I'll stop yammering, but he is exhibiting what I was saying earlier, that he is aware. He has insight, is what we call it. He knows it's weird and yet can't refrain from doing it.
It's like weird,
Yeah.
but you still have this like urge to do it.
So you just let your mind kind of just like spin.
That's
basically
actually the best way of putting it would
like
be spinning.
overthinking it and spinning.
He seems to be appreciating her words. I don't appreciate the words. She said, so you just let, and I don't know what she means by that, but the phrase, so you just let your brain spin, implies that you have a choice, and you do not have a choice. And then the word overthinking, I don't know what she means by that. It could mean a lot of things, but that is not a word I would ever use for someone. I hope, at least. But I don't know. Monica seems like a really nice person, but there are a lot of nice people that, due to their misunderstanding of mental illness, which why would they understand it, right? Will frame it in the way that they typically. They'll even try to maybe make it relatable, because we've all been there where we would quote unquote overthink someone. We meaning that we would. When I say overthink someone, I don't know if you can hear. Someone is using a weed whacker, I think. It is strangely hot today in Seattle. And I'm recording this in February, late February. And I guess this is a result of climate change, that Seattle is starting to feel more like Northern California. Now, hot for us is like 65 degrees in the winter, but there's this physiological change that people in the other latitudes will go through, where as things get colder, at first, like 60 degrees will feel really cold to us at the end of summer. But then there's something having to do with, like, I think brown fat and with blood vessel constriction or something that our body like slowly adjusts to winter. And so now 65 degrees feels like it's 80 degrees to me. But so I have to have the windows open. That's why. And so we're going to hear birds and dogs and weed whackers, and my neighbors are doing construction, I think on their roof or something. I'm not sure. So I hope that doesn't. I mean, it bugs me, or airplanes, but hopefully it doesn't bother you.
On it.
Yeah.
How did you get over that, or like kind of manage that?
At first they were like, oh, maybe we should get.
And that phrase, how did you get over that? God bless Mom. She probably just doesn't even have the language to say maybe even what she would want to say. But again, I'm not a fan of that phrase.
You on like medication, but I was like, no, I want to like try to do this on my own first.
All right, let me talk about that for a sec. And that's fine. I don't know why he would be resistant, because with medication, often you have to do both. And that's what research will indicate, that for most people suffering from OCD, the best, most robust, quickest, long-lastingest solution or symptom reduction routine regimen is involving both medication, which often has to be dialed in. It's not common that the first med or the first dosage will be magical, especially when you consider all the side effects, which are, something to consider and can be really unpleasant. And some prescribers don't emphasize the side effects enough. Some do. Anyway, so the combo of both meds and psychotherapy is the most robust way. And the medication, the way that I see it is that the medication will help people to survive until they can essentially, in my words, rewire their brain. And the way you rewire the brain is through exposure therapy. There's various different methods and what they call evidence-based practices, evidence-based therapies related to anxiety and to OCD specifically, which I won't review here now. But the general principle is that for him, for example, as his stress goes up and he's finding himself feeling the obsession of I need to count or else. That's the feeling is I need to count these things or else. And when you ask them or else what, they will say something horrible. And when you ask them what, sometimes they'll have certain things that they'll latch onto that will be semi-delusional, like everyone will die, or I'll have a heart attack, or my brain will explode, or I'll go crazy, or whatever. But typically, they don't. They don't have any concrete. They just know in every cell of their body, except for their conscious mind, that if they don't do that thing, a very, very horrible thing will happen. And it's so horrible that there's no choice. They have to count. So then they involve themselves in counting. So the exposure has to do with habituating to that fear of, okay, I'm having that fear. I need to count. I'm noticing that I have that urge. And what you want to get them to, slowly but surely, is that where they have that urge, but their body does not feel the fear associated with not doing that compulsion. So it's not, because their conscious mind knows it's not a problem, or at least they highly suspect that if they don't count the steps or whatever, probably nothing will happen. Their body's telling them something different, but their prefrontal cortex, their conscious mind is saying, I don't think that's rational. Like, what would happen? But I know, okay, so you have to get your body to habituate. And by body, I mean like most of your brain and, whatever you want to say, non-prefrontal cortex, non-conscious mind. And so what we do is we slowly expose the individual to the stimulus, the fear, in incremental amounts and intolerable amounts, while the individual does all of these pre-established routines of distress management. So you bring them up to a 4 or a 5 distress-wise, and it's easier to describe this with germs. So someone is obsessive about germs, and they have compulsions related to that obsession, and they know that it's not rational, but they can't help it. So what you might do in the first step is that you ask the client, what are the rankings of the the horrible things versus the extremely horrible things that you would do. So, like I've worked with clients before where it might be something like if they were to open a door with their hand and then wait for an hour before they wash their hand. Everybody's different, but that to them might be horrible, but not as horrible as, say, going number 2 in a public bathroom, or eating food with a fork that you don't know was sanitized. Like you go to a restaurant and the fork is just sitting there and you use that fork. So for, everyone's different. But so what we would do is one would up front, before we do any exposure, establish that they are aware of their emotions, including their distress, which not everybody is, depending on their background. That one step for some people that I've worked with can take years, honestly, because it's typically not the only reason why they're coming into therapy. The second thing that we need to, and for some people, I can establish in 15 minutes that they have that ability enough to know their emotions in the moment. They can't have necessarily just the ability to say what they were feeling an hour earlier. They need to know right now how they feel. The second step is, and for some of you that listen to my podcast or have heard me talk about trauma therapy, it's the same thing. That's why I kind of think about, because in the past, PTSD, OCD, generalized anxiety, panic disorder, all these things were under the same umbrella. They are very different, but the treatment is so similar that something is related about these things, One could argue that exposure therapy is just a subset of corrective experiences, and in my view, every therapy should involve some, for whatever it is, involves some kind of corrective experience. But anyway, so the second step is that they have independent means of regulating their emotions, particularly distress. So they have to notice their distress in the moment, and they have to have a robust ability to manage their distress in various contexts, whether they're in the car or in therapy or at home or in bed or at a party or whatever. Because they can't have just skills of distress management for when they're by themselves and they have an hour to kill so they can do whatever they want, because distress can happen anywhere. So they have to have the ability to know their emotions well, which the average person doesn't anyway, so it takes a while to establish that. Then they have to have the ability to regulate their emotions. Now, they're not going to be, no one's perfect at it, but they know that 99% of the time, if they use their techniques, that if they're a 7, they can get themselves down to a 4, or whatever range we want to talk about. So then that has to be established, and then we start doing exposure. And so then we would say, I would explain this all to the client. This would happen over months, and the client would get it. They would be worried, but I would reassure them that I was there. At any point in time, they could bail out. There's no forcefulness. There's no rigidity to this. If a client, and clients will do this, they'll come into therapy, and we would have been talking about doing exposure in that session for the past 3 months. They come into that session, they're like, I can't do this. I'd be like, fine. It's we can wait. When you're ready to do it, and let me explain it to reassure you, and da-da-da. Anyway. So then once they're ready to go and they're like, yes, let's do it. And often what I'm looking for is a client that is actually getting upset at me because I'm going slow. That's the key, because I never want to be dragging, because when you do that, you harm clients, or you risk harm to clients because you're pushing too fast and re-traumatizing them, which can happen, make it worse, make the obsession worse. So, and you can also alienate them from therapy, which is not a good thing. So once the client is like, okay, Kirk, I get it. You care about re-traumatizing me, but I want to do this. All right, well, okay, sounds like it's time to go. Then I would introduce, we would explore the different hierarchy of triggers. And let's say for this particular client, it's opening the door. So what I would have them do is, for experts, they do it with the client. We have terminology for this, but anyway, so because often therapy involves talk, and then the client does their life and then comes back and reports what happened. With exposure therapy like this, it's probably you can do it that way, but it's probably important to have the clinician there to help the client. So I would have them leave my office and then come in with their bare hand, not with a handkerchief or anything, open the door, and don't, disinfect the doorknob at all. Open the door, come in and sit down and not wash their hand, not disinfect their hand. And I would ask them, how do you feel? And they'd be like, I'm freaking out. I really want to wash my hand. I'd be like, okay, How much distress? I'm a 5. I'm a 6. How do you know that? Well, because of this. How do you know you're not an 8? Well, because I'm not having this thing. Okay, do your thing, but don't avoid. Don't deny that you did it, because you need to get used to this, and you do this enough times. I do this enough times, and there will be a point if we both do it right, which is actually, it's not that hard. I'm describing it to you. It doesn't sound that hard, right? It's not like rocket science. If we do this enough times, eventually the client will do this, will open the door, sit on my couch, and look at their hand and say, I don't have any distress about it, because the body learns. The rest of the brain learns. It gets used to it. It habituates to it. It says, this is not actually associated with danger. I've been avoiding this because my body knew it was associated with something horrible and dangerous and threatening, but it was just making that up. It was assuming that, but now my body knows, because it has experienced this without any danger, and I've done my relaxation so that my body can know that I'm okay. Because if I have massive adrenaline surges every time I'm doing this, then my body is like, don't see, this is danger, danger, danger. Okay. So then we go to the next thing. And then eventually down the road, they habituate to going number 2 in a public restroom and not running home and showering and, taking a blowtorch to their butt or whatever, And that's another thing, is that if the client is up for it, having a little levity and joking around, but not ridiculing or shaming or anything, can be good, and a lot of clients will do that. And it can help with the emotional regulation. Just to be like, here I go again, but not shaming. Anyway. So yeah, that's me yammering about that. But it sounds like so he was talking about not taking medication. Can someone recover from OCD without medication? Yeah. But often, especially if it's severe in the beginning, I will encourage clients to listen to their prescriber and not be afraid of medication, but also understand that if it's not for them or the side effects are too worrisome or too bothersome, medication isn't typically the long-term solution anyway. But this sort of bias and assumption that medications are going to make you into a zombie or something is often overblown. Because one of the things that medication can help with is it can help people with those early phases of treatment, and is more reassuring to me that they won't be, because one of the risks is that if the client comes to me saying they want help with OCD, and even if I say, and by the way, if you want to put that on the back burner and work on something else for a while, I'm not going to ever pressure you to work on your OCD. They might still think that I will judge them if they want to put their OCD on the back burner, which is often the case with people with severe OCD. It's just like, it's too overwhelming. It's too scary to think about having to face it, And so they'll blow out of therapy because they're worried that I'm going to be upset with them because they don't want to do the OCD treatment protocol. And even if I reassure them. So it's so the medication can help people with that early phase, because often the early phase of therapy is the result of increasing OCD symptoms to like some breaking point. So usually things aren't going so well at that period. Anyway.
And see if I can overcome it.
Yeah.
Which was weird that I even did that at a young age.
Yeah.
But exposure therapy is what we would use in the term of psychology.
Good. So I'm going to rewind it, but I think what he said was, as a younger person, even as a kid, he knew that the solution was to push back on the obsession and the compulsion and get acclimated, or to remind himself that there isn't danger on the other end of that unknown chasm if I don't count everything. So it sounds like as a kid, he just came to that conclusion, which some people will. I'll rewind that.
Get over that, or how to manage that.
at first they were like, oh, maybe we should get you on like medication. But I was like, no, I want to like try to do this on my own first and see if I can like overcome it.
Yeah.
Which was weird that like I even did that at like a young age.
Yeah.
But exposure therapy is what like we would use in like the term of psychology.
Yeah. So I'll hear that sometimes, and I would imagine that his OCD was not severe. It sounds not pleasant, right? But I have worked with people and know people personally who have that awareness, but it's so overpowering, the OCD, that they don't have any chance just doing things on their own. That doesn't necessarily mean that they need medication, but it sounds like he had a significant case, mild to moderate, and could be legitimately diagnosed with OCD, but it wasn't as severe as some other cases, or he nipped it in the bud, which sometimes will happen is if he hadn't addressed it or didn't have that strength, and it sounds like I think he's referring to his parents. So it sounds like there was support around that, and the parents or the evaluators, the professionals were recommending medication. So it sounds like there was some support and awareness around that, which is nice to hear, because there's a lot of people, kids included, who are suffering from OCD. And when they are noticed or they alert their parents and other people, they are told to just get over it or stop it, or why are you doing this to yourself, or I don't have time for this shit, or, it happens.
Yeah.
And so I basically just like forced myself to do it.
That's a lot to change like your whole way of thinking.
Yeah.
On your own.
Yeah, it was weird. I was a weirdo.
We're all weirdos. We're all weirdos. And
yeah, I'm sure the story is way more complicated than that, but as a summary of that story, it sounds like they've maybe talked about it before a little bit, and now they're talking about it more in depth. But yeah, good for Joey. That's great. I'm really happy. It sounds like there's still some it sounds like she might have some preference for order, not OCD necessarily, but I'm happy for Joey for sure.
Some way.
So Monica seems like a really great person. You've watched ahead. Maybe she's a monster. I have a hard time imagining that. But I will say that her reaction is as good as would hope for. And if he will, in the future, which is typical, have upswings of emotions or of symptoms, then I would imagine that she has some room to still grasp what OCD is and what it is for him. I don't doubt that she would grasp that and put in the effort to grasp it, but the way that she's framing it, like, I'm trying to think what I would have thought would be an ideal yet completely unrealistic reaction for Monica, and that would be not using those few words that I don't even know what necessarily Monica means. And again, I don't blame her, but not using words like overthinking or let yourself, that kind of stuff. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, and he seems to be taking it well. So what does it matter about my opinion from the outside? Watching a TV show doesn't matter at all, really. But I point all this out because, one, for people out there who have OCD, as I was talking about how anxiety disorders, if we consider OCD to be at least in that broad category, is very common. Something like, don't quote me on this, but I think like a third of Americans will suffer from some full-blown anxiety disorder at some point in their life. I mean, just think about that. We're not talking about like minor symptoms. We're talking about full-blown mental illness at some point in someone's life. Anxiety, a third of Americans at some point in their life. I mean, maybe that's a little overblown. Maybe it's more like a 25%, but still, it's a shit ton of people. And some of you likely not only have now or in the past or have yet to discover that you are suffering from an anxiety disorder, but OCD specifically, right? And what I would hope from me saying that Monica's reaction, although is as good as we can expect, could have been a little better. I don't blame Monica. I say this because you deserve to have people react to you in the following way eventually, with awareness and education for your friends and family and spouses and coworkers, that they, again, wouldn't use those words because they wouldn't know how they'd be interpreted, but the reaction would be, wow, that sounds like a lot of, tell me more, or tell me what you want to tell me. What does that feel like to you? And also, wow, what strength you had as a kid. And she did basically communicate that. And then at the end, to frame it as, we're all weird. I get it again, and it sounds like they're having a good time, but I guess I should just speak for myself. If I were in his shoes and I were to talk with my wife about something like this, I would not want my wife to say something like, we're all weird. And again, I don't want to crap on Monica, but it's not that. I personally wouldn't want that. I would want just, because that gives the idea of just like, we're all a little quirky, we're all a little weird. We have all our little hang-ups or whatever. OCD is severe suffering, as I've been talking about. So it's not just being weird. It's not just having weird things that you latch onto in your brain. It is a mental illness that causes, the kind of suffering that if you've never had something like that, you could never imagine. I mean, there are people who have more severe OCD, which is common for people with OCD, in which they are in the midst of their obsession and thus their compulsions at every second that they are awake. There's no point, it's not just when they're walking they will count, or it's not just when something is a little off kilter that it'll irk them. They are in the midst of their obsession and their compulsions to correct for it in their way constantly, every second of every day. And life from other aspects of life can only sneak in kind of to, they're essentially multitasking their OCD with whatever in their life, work or parenting or putting gas in their car or whatever. And it's rough. It's horrible. It is suffering on the highest level. So it isn't just being weird. And for them, they have their way of talking about it, and they're great. But for you, and if someone in your life ever talks about this or shows signs of it, there's a good chance for you who have kids now or have had kids in the past, meaning they've grown up and moved out of the house, or are going to have kids, there is a high likelihood that there's a fair percentage of you that will have kids with some sort of anxiety issue, and specifically OCD. So it's important to comprehend and grasp and understand, so that if you have a 10-year-old, because OCD often will show up in young children, or some phobia or some tendency, there's certain sort of proto-OCD things that you'll see in children, and being able to detect that, because kids won't know what's happening to them, right? So I guess while I'm on this topic, just off the top of my head, of course, if you see your kid counting things in ways that seem a little strange, if they are very particular about bedtime routines and morning time routines, if they get real bent out of shape when there are inconsistencies regarding routines of like breakfast, or how they put on their clothes, or how you the route you take to take them to school, or how they put their clothes on, or how they do how they go to the bathroom, how they brush their teeth, the way they eat, the things that they eat. There can be a lot of, as I'm saying this out loud, I want to be clear that if you saw things like this, OCD would be on the short list, but there are other issues that are related that well, I guess just generally speaking, if you see anything like this, it's a red flag, and it doesn't mean that you rush them off to the hospital, but you notice and inquire in a way that is comfortable for the kid and age appropriate to the kid, because eventually, if you are going to take action, you'll be the one talking to the professional. We can't depend on 8-year-olds to describe and feel comfortable talking with a stranger in a psychiatric office about their experience. So you are the key to helping, obviously. And so knowing how to say, oh, so I see that you're doing that. I like to do that too sometimes. What are you doing exactly? Or what if you didn't do that? How would you feel about it? Whatever. You want to be as light and inviting and open as possible. You don't want to give the impression, why are you doing that? What's going on with you? Because, even if you're a really good parent and you have a lot of love in your heart, kids can interpret things poorly. So you got to be real, particularly with the skittish kids, that are more prone to that kind of like paranoia of like, what am I doing something, and it's like, oh crap, they're turtling. So you got to be careful with that. But and kudos to Joey for talking about it in front of the cameras. Kudos to the show for including it. I'm guessing there have been other conversations like this that have been edited out. So, and by the way, I looked up on Wikipedia how many episodes are planned for this season, and it looks like there's going to be 4 different published, 4 Fridays that they're publishing the episodes. Usually there's 5, at least in recent history. And that means that right now, where I am, tomorrow is, I believe, the 3rd installment. And I think that's going to be the weddings. And then a week from tomorrow will be the reunion for my time. For you, I'm sure it's already past the reunion. I don't know. But I'm a little surprised by that because, I think what that means in terms of where because this is episode 7, so they're in the getaway. They're at the beginning of the getaway, like in the first 48 hours of it. And so it makes me think that there isn't much drama beyond this point because there's no Monica and Alex and Mason and Meg. Also, by the way, I've heard that there are 2 other couples that were excluded from the show, which I plan on looking into after I finish episode 9. So I guess watch out for that. I also took a survey of everyone after episode 9 had published, and I just closed that survey, and I'm going to review that as well as a litmus test or a sort of a mid-season check-in with your attitudes, who you like, who you dislike, and any hot takes. So watch out for that as well. Those will be member videos. But anyway. All right, well, let's adjourn there. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.